The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple as Zachariah Nichols rode his Mustang across the dusty plains of Wyoming Territory. The year was 1878, and like the setting sun, Zachariah's faith had long since disappeared behind the mountains of his troubled past. Blood caked his spurs and dust coated his throat as he guided his horse toward the distant lights of Promise Creek. 3 days on the trail chasing rustlers had left him bone-weary, his angular face rough with stubble, blue eyes hard as river stones. The bounty would keep him fed through winter, but the killing never sat right with him anymore. "Almost there, Ranger," he murmured to his chestnut stallion, patting its sweat-slicked neck. "Then we can both rest a spell." The town emerged from the darkness like a mirage, a collection of wooden buildings straddling the creek that gave the settlement its name. The saloon's piano music drifted through the night air, a tinny melody punctuated by raucous laughter. Zachariah avoided it, guiding Ranger toward the livery stable at the edge of town. "Evening, Mr. Nichols," called the stable boy, no more than 18, with freckles scattered across his nose. "Caught them rustlers, did you?" Zachariah dismounted, his legs stiff after the long ride. "I did." "Marshal Watson can verify when he's sober enough to sign the papers tomorrow. You staying in town long?" "Just till I collect my bounty." Zachariah handed the reins to the boy. "Grain and a good brushing for Ranger, he's earned it." With his saddlebags slung over his shoulder, Zachariah made his way to the boarding house run by Mrs. Holden, a widow who never asked questions about the blood on his clothes or the revolver holstered at his hip. It was why he preferred her establishment to the hotel across the street. The boarding house was quiet when he entered, the oil lamp in the foyer turned low. Mrs. Holden appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Mr. Nichols, welcome back. Your usual room is ready." "Much obliged, madam. There's stew on the stove if you're hungry." His stomach growled in response. "I'd be grateful." The stew was hearty chunks of venison swimming in thick gravy with carrots and potatoes. Zachariah ate in silence at the kitchen table, savoring the first hot meal he'd had since leaving town. Mrs. Holden busied herself with mending by the fireplace, respecting his need for quiet. "New folks in town," she said finally, threading her needle by lamplight. "Doctor and his daughter arrived last week from Boston, set up practice where old Doc Miller used to be." Zachariah nodded but offered no comment. Townsfolk came and went, especially doctors. Most couldn't stomach frontier medicine for long. "She's a pretty one, his daughter," Mrs. Holden continued, a hint of matchmaking in her voice. "About 25, I'd say, educated too. Helps her father with his patients." "Mrs. Holden," Zachariah said, setting down his spoon, "I appreciate the information, but I'm not looking for a wife." The widow smiled knowingly. "Did I say anything about a wife, Mr. Nichols? I merely mentioned new folks in town. It's common courtesy to welcome newcomers, especially those who might save your life someday." Zachariah conceded with a slight nod. "I'll tip my hat if I see them." After washing up in the basin provided, Zachariah climbed the narrow stairs to his room. It was sparse: a bed, a nightstand, a chair by the window, but clean. He stripped off his trail-worn clothes and lay back on the mattress, staring at the ceiling. Sleep eluded him, as it often did after a hunt. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the faces of the men he'd killed, not just today's rustlers, but all of them stretching back to the war. Before that, he'd been a different man, a man who believed in something beyond himself. His father had been a preacher in a small Pennsylvania town, a man of unwavering faith who taught his son the power of prayer. But the war changed everything. Zachariah saw too much death, caused too much suffering. When a Confederate shell tore through his father's congregation during a Sunday service, killing the old preacher instantly, Zachariah's faith died with him. He hadn't prayed since that day. What was the point? If there was a God, he had abandoned Zachariah long ago. Dawn broke cold and clear, sunlight streaming through the thin curtains of his room. Zachariah dressed quickly in his cleanest shirt and trousers, strapped on his gun belt, and headed downstairs for coffee before visiting the marshal's office to claim his bounty. The town was beginning to stir, shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks, the blacksmith's forge already glowing with heat. Promise Creek was growing, Zachariah noted. New buildings had sprung up since his last visit 3 months ago. As he passed the doctor's office, a woman emerged carrying a basket of linens. She paused on the step, looking up at the cloudless sky, her face lifted to the sun like a flower seeking warmth. Her hair, the color of honey, was pinned at the nape of her neck with loose tendrils framing her face. Zachariah found himself slowing his pace, studying her. She wore a simple blue dress, modest but well-tailored. There was something in her expression, a serenity that seemed out of place in a frontier town. She turned, sensing his gaze, and their eyes met. Hers were the shade of summer sage, clear and direct. She nodded politely, and Zachariah tipped his hat, remembering his promise to Mrs. Holden. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying a trace of her Eastern upbringing. "Madam," he replied, continuing on his way. Marshal Watson was nursing a hangover when Zachariah arrived at his office. The lawman squinted at him from behind his desk, recognition slowly dawning. "Nichols, heard you brought in the Harker boys. All 3 of them, dead, I'm afraid." The marshal sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "Figured as much. They weren't the type to surrender peacefully." "They weren't." Zachariah pulled a chair closer to the desk and sat. "About my payment, county authorized $300 for the lot." "I've got the papers here somewhere." Watson rummaged through the stack of documents before him, finally extracting a form. "Just need your mark." Zachariah signed where indicated, and the marshal counted out the money, crisp greenbacks and a handful of gold eagles. It was a good sum, enough to last until spring if he was careful. "Staying in town?" Watson asked, leaning back in his chair. "Few days, maybe. Need to resupply before heading north." "North? Not much up there but Sioux and cold weather." "Exactly." Zachariah pocketed the money. "Quiet is what I'm after," the marshal chuckled. "Well, you might find some of that here if you stick around. Town's settled down some since Judge Parker started sending the worst troublemakers to his gallows in Fort Smith." Zachariah rose to leave. "I'll keep that in mind." Outside, the day had warmed considerably. Zachariah decided to visit the general store before returning to the boarding house. He needed ammunition, coffee, and tobacco trail necessities. The bell above the door jangled as he entered Thompson's Mercantile. The store smelled of leather, spices, and coffee beans, a familiar, comforting aroma. Old man Thompson nodded from behind the counter, where he was helping a customer. It was the doctor's daughter. Up close, Zachariah could see the fine lines around her eyes that suggested she was indeed in her mid-20s, and the subtle strength in her slender hands as she examined a bolt of cloth. "This will do nicely for bandages, Mr. Thompson," she was saying. "And I'll need more of that carbolic acid when your next shipment arrives." "Yes, Miss Flynn, I've already ordered it. Should be here on next week's stage." She thanked him and gathered her purchases. As she turned to leave, she nearly collided with Zachariah, who stepped back quickly. "Excuse me," she said, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "No harm done, madam." He moved aside to let her pass, but she paused, looking at him more carefully. "You're the bounty hunter, aren't you? Mrs. Holden mentioned you." Zachariah frowned. Had the entire town been discussing him in his absence? "I track fugitives for the reward, yes." "My father could use someone with your skills." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Not for bounty hunting, of course, but perhaps you could help us with another matter." Curiosity got the better of him. "What kind of matter?" "We're trying to establish a small infirmary separate from my father's office for patients with contagious ailments. The building needs work, and most of the men in town are busy with the railroad spur or their own businesses." "I'm not much of a carpenter, Miss Flynn." "It's Elizabeth," she said, "and we don't need fine carpentry, just sturdy walls and a roof that doesn't leak. Father says you can name your price." Zachariah considered the offer. The bounty money was good, but extra work would mean he could stock up better for the winter months. Besides, he had no urgent need to leave Promise Creek just yet. "I'll take a look at the building," he said finally. "Can't promise more than that." Her smile transformed her face, lighting up her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Nichols." "Zachariah Nichols." "Thank you, Mr. Nichols. The building is just behind my father's office. Could you come by this afternoon?" He nodded, and she departed with her packages, the bell announcing her exit. Thompson chuckled from behind the counter. "That one's got most of the eligible men in town tied in knots," the shopkeeper said. "Educated, pretty, and kind-hearted. Her father's protective, though. Dr. Flynn watches over her like a hawk. "I'm just looking at a building, Thompson, not courting the lady." "Course you are," Thompson replied, not bothering to hide his amusement. "Now, what can I get for you today?" After purchasing his supplies, Zachariah returned to the boarding house to store his gear and clean his weapons, a ritual that centered him. By early afternoon, he found himself standing behind the doctor's office, examining a dilapidated structure that had once been a storage shed. Elizabeth Flynn stood nearby, pointing out where windows should be added for ventilation. She spoke with knowledge and confidence about the requirements for treating infectious diseases, making it clear she was more than just the doctor's assistant. "My father believes separation is key to preventing the spread of illness," she explained. "During the cholera outbreak in Boston last year, we saw how quickly disease moves through crowded wards. This town's lucky to have doctors who understand such things," Zachariah commented, testing the stability of a supporting beam. "We're fortunate to be here," she replied. "Boston had too many doctors and too much politics. Father wanted to practice medicine, not attend society functions to secure wealthy patients." Dr. Flynn himself appeared then, a tall man with a trim beard streaked with gray. Despite his formal Eastern attire, he carried himself with the practicality of a man who understood frontier realities. "Mr. Nichols," he said, extending his hand, "my daughter speaks highly of your willingness to assist us." Zachariah shook the offered hand. "Haven't agreed to anything yet, doctor, just assessing the work." "Of course." The doctor gestured toward the building. "What's your professional opinion?" "It needs more than repair. You'd be better off tearing it down and starting fresh. The foundation is sound, but the framing is rotted in places and the roof won't last another winter." Dr. Flynn's face fell. "I see, that sounds considerably more expensive than I anticipated." "Not necessarily," Zachariah countered. "Lumber's plentiful here, unlike back east, and if you can rally a few volunteers for a day, the work goes quickly." Elizabeth stepped forward eagerly. "A building party, like barn raisings back home, we could provide food and drink for the workers." Her enthusiasm was infectious, and Zachariah found himself nodding. "It could work. I know the foreman at the sawmill. He might cut you a deal on the lumber, especially if you've treated any of his men." "Several," Dr. Flynn confirmed, "including his son after that nasty fall last month." "Then let me talk to him. If he agrees, we could have your infirmary up before the first snow." And so Zachariah found himself unexpectedly involved in a community project, something he'd avoided for years. He preferred to drift in and out of towns, leaving little impression beyond his reputation as a manhunter. But there was something about Elizabeth Flynn's determination that made him want to see this through. The next morning, he rode out to the sawmill 3 miles east of town. The foreman, a burly Norwegian named Larson, remembered Zachariah from previous dealings and was receptive to the proposal, especially when he learned it was for the doctor who had saved his son's leg. "I give good price," Larson promised, "and send 2 men to help with building." "Dr. Flynn is good man." Zachariah returned to town with the good news and found Elizabeth at her father's office, taking inventory of medical supplies. Her face brightened when he told her about Larson's offer. "That's wonderful. I've already spoken with Mrs. Thompson at the Mercantile and Mrs. Holden at the boarding house. They've agreed to organize food for the workers, and Marshal Watson says he can spare himself and his deputy for the day." Her excitement was palpable, and Zachariah found himself smiling in response, a rare occurrence these days. "We could start this Saturday," he suggested, "if the weather holds." "Saturday is perfect." She hesitated, then added, "Would you join us for dinner tonight? Father would like to thank you properly for your help." Zachariah's instinct was to decline. Sharing meals led to conversation, which led to questions about his past, questions he preferred to avoid. But something in Elizabeth's expectant expression made refusal difficult. "I'd be honored," he heard himself say. The Flynn residence was a modest house adjacent to the doctor's office, recently painted and well-maintained despite its age. Inside, it was furnished simply but comfortably, with touches of Eastern refinement, books lining the shelves, a piano in the corner, framed sketches of Boston harbors and buildings on the walls. Dinner was a surprisingly elegant affair for a frontier town: roast beef with vegetables, fresh bread, and even a bottle of wine the doctor had brought from Massachusetts. The conversation flowed easily, focusing on the infirmary plans and town developments rather than personal histories, much to Zachariah's relief. It was only when they moved to the parlor for coffee that Dr. Flynn asked the question Zachariah had been dreading. "Were you always a bounty hunter, Mr. Nichols?" Zachariah stared into his coffee cup. "No, I fought in the War Union Cavalry. Before that, I worked my father's farm in Pennsylvania." "The war changed many things for many people," Dr. Flynn said quietly. "I lost my wife to typhoid in a field hospital where I was serving. Elizabeth was just 10. "I'm sorry for your loss," Zachariah replied, meaning it. He glanced at Elizabeth, seeing her in a new light, a young girl growing up without a mother, raised amid the chaos of war. "Life continues," the doctor said philosophically. "We adapt, we find new purposes." Elizabeth rose and moved to the piano. "Shall I play something, Father, something cheerful to offset all this solemnity?" The doctor smiled fondly. "Please do, my dear." Her fingers moved skillfully over the keys, producing a lilting melody that filled the small parlor with warmth. Zachariah watched her, noticing the slight furrow of concentration between her brows, the way her lips parted slightly as she played. There was a depth to her that intrigued him, strength beneath the genteel exterior. When she finished, Zachariah joined Dr. Flynn in applauding. "You play beautifully, Miss Flynn." "Elizabeth, please," she corrected him, "and thank you, music has always been my solace." "As medicine has been mine," her father added. "And yours, Mr. Nichols, what brings you peace in difficult times?" The question caught Zachariah off guard. Peace, he'd forgotten what that felt like. "The trail," he said finally. "Open country where a man can breathe, Doctor." Flynn nodded thoughtfully. "I understand the appeal. Before Elizabeth was born, I considered joining a wagon train west. The freedom of it called to me." "What stopped you?" Zachariah asked. "I met my wife." The doctor smiled at the memory. "She preferred city comforts to prairie hardships." "And she was right. Raising a child on the trail would have been challenging." Elizabeth rejoined them, sitting beside her father on the settee. "Yet here we are anyway, just 20 years later than planned." The evening concluded pleasantly, with promises to meet at the building site on Saturday morning. As Zachariah walked back to the boarding house under a canopy of stars, he felt oddly content. It had been years since he'd enjoyed simple conversation that didn't involve tracking criminals or negotiating bounties. Saturday dawned bright and clear, perfect weather for construction. By mid-morning, the site behind the doctor's office was bustling with activity. Larson had delivered the lumber as promised, along with 2 skilled sawyers. Marshal Watson and his deputy were there, as were several other townsmen Zachariah recognized from previous visits to Promise Creek. Elizabeth and the town women had set up tables laden with food and drink for the workers. She moved among them, offering encouragement and refreshments, her honey-colored hair gathered in a simple braid that swung when she walked. Zachariah found himself in charge by unspoken agreement, directing the men as they dismantled the old structure and began framing the new one. It felt good to work with his hands, to create rather than destroy. By noon, the foundation was cleared and the new frame was taking shape. "You have done this before," Larson commented as they paused for a meal break. "You know building." Zachariah nodded, accepting a plate of fried chicken from Mrs. Thompson. "My father and I built our barn and added onto our house, learned carpentry from my grandfather. You are a man of many skills," the Norwegian observed. The work continued through the afternoon, and as the sun began to set, the basic structure stood complete, walls framed, roof beams in place. The windows and interior work would have to wait for another day, but it was remarkable progress for a single day's labor, Doctor. Flynn surveyed the results with satisfaction. "I can't thank you all enough," he told the assembled workers. "This infirmary will save lives when illness strikes our town." There was a round of handshakes and backslapping as the men prepared to depart, satisfied with their contribution. Zachariah found himself lingering, helping to clean up the scattered tools and lumber scraps. Elizabeth approached, offering a cup of cool water. "You worked harder than anyone today," she said. "Father and I are incredibly grateful." Zachariah accepted the water, suddenly aware of how dusty and sweat-stained he must appear. It was good work, purposeful. Will you continue tomorrow? There's still much to do, he hesitated. His original plan had been to leave town within a few days, but the project was unfinished. I'll stay until it's complete, he decided. Assuming your father still wants my help. Of course he does, we both do. She smiled up at him, her face flushed from the day's activities. You've become indispensable, Mr. Nichols. Zachariah, he corrected her. If I'm to keep building your infirmary, you might as well use my given name. Zachariah, she repeated, testing the sound of it. It suits you biblical and strong. The work on the infirmary continued over the next week. Each day, Zachariah arrived early and stayed late, finding satisfaction in the tangible progress. Elizabeth was often present, assisting where she could and bringing food and drink for the workers who could spare time from their regular jobs to help. During these days, Zachariah learned more about Elizabeth Flynn. She had trained informally under her father's guidance since childhood and had a natural aptitude for medicine. In Boston, she had been allowed to attend medical lectures meant for male students, though she could never formally enroll in medical school. It's different here, she told him as they installed the last window. Father lets me treat patients, women and children mostly. They accept me because there's no alternative, but I like to think I've earned their trust over time. You would have made a fine doctor, Zachariah observed. I am a doctor in all but degree, she replied without rancor, and here that's enough. I can help people ease suffering. That's all I've ever wanted. Her dedication to her calling reminded Zachariah of his father's devotion to his ministry. Both served others without reservation, believing in a higher purpose. The comparison made him uncomfortable, stirring memories he'd long suppressed. By the end of the week, the infirmary was nearly complete, a sturdy structure with 4 patient beds, storage for medical supplies, and a small stove for heat. Dr. Flynn had ordered specialized equipment from Denver, but the building itself was ready for use. We should celebrate, Elizabeth declared on Friday evening as they applied the final coat of whitewash to the interior walls. A small gathering to thank everyone who helped, especially you. Zachariah wiped his hands on a rag, leaving streaks of white. No need for special recognition. I was paid fairly for my time. It's not about payment, she insisted. It's about community, about marking the completion of something important together. Her words stirred something in Zachariah, a longing for connection he hadn't felt in years. Since the war, he deliberately avoided putting down roots, convinced that attachments only led to pain when inevitably severed. A small gathering, he conceded, but nothing elaborate, Elizabeth beamed. Tomorrow evening, then, at our house. The celebration was larger than Zachariah had anticipated. It seemed everyone who had contributed even an hour's labor to the infirmary had been invited, along with their families. The Flynn home was filled with people, conversation, and laughter. Zachariah found himself cornered by well-meaning townsfolk who expressed gratitude for his leadership on the project. Marshall Watson even suggested he consider a more permanent position in Promise Creek. Town's growing, the lawman said, nursing a glass of whiskey. Could use a man with your skills, maybe as a deputy or even running your own carpentry business. I appreciate the thought, Marshall, but I'm not one for settling down, Watson shrugged. Just something to consider. Man can't live on the trail forever. Later, as the gathering began to thin, Zachariah stepped outside for air. The night was cool, stars brilliant in the clear sky. He heard the door open behind him and turned to find Elizabeth joining him on the porch. Escaping? She asked, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. Just needed some quiet. It was a fine celebration. Yes, it was. She moved to stand beside him at the porch railing. Everyone is so pleased with the infirmary. You've done a wonderful thing for this town, Zachariah. We all did it together, he corrected her. That's what you wanted, community. She studied his profile in the moonlight. Will you be leaving soon? The question hung between them, weighted with implications Zachariah wasn't ready to examine. I should. Winter's coming, and I need to find shelter before the pass is close. You could shelter here, she said softly. Promise Creek isn't such a bad place to spend a winter. Before he could respond, Dr. Flynn appeared at the door. Elizabeth, Mrs. Larson is asking for you, something about sharing that cranberry preserve recipe. Elizabeth smiled at her father. I'll be right there. Turning back to Zachariah, she added, Think about it before returning inside, and he did think about it all night and into the next day. The idea of staying in Promise Creek through winter was tempting in ways he hadn't expected. The town had begun to feel familiar, almost comfortable, and Elizabeth Flynn. She challenged him, interested him. Her combination of Eastern refinement and frontier practicality was unlike any woman he'd known. When she spoke of her medical work, her face illuminated with purpose and passion. It reminded him of a time when he too had believed in something greater than himself. But staying meant explaining his past eventually. It meant questions about his family, about the war, about the years since. It meant acknowledging the hollow space inside him where faith had once resided. On Sunday morning, while most of the town attended church services, Zachariah rode Ranger into the hills surrounding Promise Creek. He needed space to think, away from Elizabeth's hopeful glances and the townspeople's increasing acceptance. He found a high meadow overlooking the valley and dismounted, letting Ranger graze while he sat against a boulder, pipe in hand. The tobacco smoke curled lazily in the still air as he considered his options. He could leave, as he'd always done before. Move north into Montana territory, find work at one of the cattle ranches, keep to himself. It was the safer path, the one that protected him from attachment and loss, or he could stay, at least through winter. Take up Marshall Watson's suggestion of deputy work or carpentry. Get to know Elizabeth Flynn better, see if the spark of interest between them could grow into something more substantial. The second option terrified him more than any gunfight ever had. By the time he returned to town, the sun was setting. As he approached the boarding house, he noticed unusual activity at the doctor's office, lamps burning bright despite the late hour, people coming and going with worried expressions. Mrs. Holden was waiting on the boarding house porch, her normally placid face creased with concern. "There you are, Mr. Nichols. We've been looking all over for you." "What's happened?" he asked, dismounting quickly. "It's Miss Flynn. She's taken ill suddenly, a terrible fever. Dr. Flynn is beside himself with worry." Zachariah felt his stomach drop. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough. She collapsed while treating a child this afternoon. The doctor says it might be typhoid." Without another word, Zachariah handed Ranger's reins to Mrs. Holden and strode toward the doctor's office. Inside, he found organized chaos, the waiting room transformed into a sick room, with Elizabeth lying pale and still on a narrow examination table. Dr. Flynn bent over her, his face haggard as he pressed a cool cloth to her forehead. "Doctor," Zachariah said quietly, "Doctor." Flynn looked up, momentary relief crossing his features. "Mr. Nichols, I'm glad you're here. I could use another pair of hands. Tell me what to do." For the next several hours, Zachariah followed the doctor's instructions, fetching water, helping move Elizabeth to a more comfortable bed in their home, preparing the medicines Dr. Flynn prescribed. The night stretched endlessly as Elizabeth's fever rose, her breathing becoming labored. Near dawn, Dr. Flynn sank into a chair beside his daughter's bed, exhaustion etched in every line of his face. "I've done everything I know to do," he murmured. "Now we wait." Zachariah stood awkwardly by the door, unwilling to leave but unsure of his place in this intimate family crisis. "Is there nothing else? No other treatment?" The doctor shook his head. "Medical science has its limits, Mr. Nichols. Sometimes all we can offer is comfort and hope." Hope, the word struck Zachariah like a physical blow. What did he know of hope? He'd abandoned it years ago, along with his faith. "I'll stay with her," Dr. Flynn said. "You should rest. You've been a great help." But Zachariah didn't leave. Instead, he pulled a chair to the other side of Elizabeth's bed and sat, watching her labored breathing, the flush of fever on her cheeks. She looked smaller somehow, fragile in a way that belied her usual vitality. "Doctor." Flynn eventually succumbed to exhaustion, his head nodding forward as he dozed in his chair. Zachariah remained awake, his eyes fixed on Elizabeth's face, willing her to fight to survive. As the first rays of morning light filtered through the curtains, Elizabeth's condition worsened. Her breathing became more erratic, and despite the cool compresses, her skin burned with fever. Dr. Flynn awoke with a start, immediately checking his daughter's pulse. The grim set of his mouth told Zachariah all he needed to know. "She's weakening," the doctor said, his professional detachment cracking. "I don't understand it. She was perfectly healthy yesterday morning." "What can I do?" Zachariah asked, desperate to be useful. "Pray," Dr. Flynn replied simply, "if you're a praying man." The words hit Zachariah like a blow. Pray. He hadn't prayed since his father's death, hadn't believed anyone was listening. But now, faced with Elizabeth's mortality, he felt a desperate yearning for the faith he'd once known. Dr. Flynn left to prepare more medicine, and Zachariah found himself alone with Elizabeth. Her breathing was shallow, her skin ashen beneath the fever's flush. He reached for her hand, surprised by how small and hot it felt in his own. "Don't you leave," he whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare leave, Elizabeth Flynn. This town needs you, your father needs you." "I need you," he thought but couldn't say aloud. Something broke inside Zachariah, then a wall he'd built years ago, brick by brick, to protect himself from pain. Behind that wall lay the remnants of his faith, dusty and neglected but not entirely destroyed. Almost without conscious thought, he found himself slipping from the chair to his knees beside Elizabeth's bed, still clutching her hand. Words came to him, half-remembered prayers from childhood, phrases his father had taught him to recite in times of trouble. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Please don't take her too," and then more clearly a single word. "Elizabeth." Her name became a prayer, encompassing all his fears and hopes. "Elizabeth," he repeated, a whispered plea to whatever higher power might be listening. He stayed that way for a long time, kneeling in the quiet room, Elizabeth's name on his lips like a sacred incantation. When Dr. Flynn returned, he found Zachariah still there, his head bowed, hands clasped around his daughter's slender fingers. The doctor didn't comment on the scene, merely moved to check Elizabeth's pulse and temperature once more. His eyebrows rose slightly. "Her fever's breaking," he said, disbelief coloring his tone. "It's slight but definite." Zachariah raised his head, hardly daring to hope. "Is she going to recover? It's too soon to say for certain." Dr. Flynn pressed his palm to Elizabeth's forehead. "But this is the first positive sign since she fell ill." Throughout the day, Elizabeth's condition gradually improved. Her breathing became more regular, her pulse stronger. By evening, she was conscious for brief periods, though confused and weak. Zachariah remained at her side, leaving only when necessary, returning as quickly as possible. He brought food for Dr. Flynn, insisted the older man rest, and took his turn bathing Elizabeth's face and hands with cool water. On the third day, Elizabeth awoke fully lucid, her eyes clear as they focused on Zachariah dozing in the chair beside her bed. "Zachariah," she murmured, her voice hoarse from disuse. He jerked awake immediately. "Elizabeth, how do you feel?" "Terrible," she admitted with a weak smile. "But alive, what happened?" "Typhoid, your father thinks you've been very ill." She tried to sit up, but strength failed her. Zachariah gently helped her, arranging pillows to support her back. "How long?" "3 days. Your father's sleeping now, he's hardly left your side." "And you?" she asked, studying his face with its stubble and dark circles beneath the eyes. "Have you been here all this time?" Zachariah nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "I wanted to help." "Thank you," she said simply, reaching for his hand. Her fingers were cool now, the fever gone. "I think I remember your voice through the darkness. Were you praying?" The question caught him off guard. Had she heard him in her delirium? "I might have been," he admitted reluctantly. "It's been a long time." "What made you start again?" He looked at their joined hands, unable to meet her eyes. "Fear of losing you," he said quietly. "I've lost too many people I care about. I couldn't bear to lose another." It was the closest he'd come to acknowledging the feelings growing inside him, feelings he'd tried to ignore since their first meeting. Elizabeth's fingers tightened around his, and when he finally raised his gaze to hers, he saw understanding there. "I'm not going anywhere," she promised, Dr. Flynn entered then, his face transforming with joy when he saw his daughter awake and alert. "Elizabeth," thank God, the reunion between father and daughter was emotional, and Zachariah slipped quietly from the room to give them privacy. Outside, he leaned against the wall of the house, suddenly overcome by exhaustion and relief. Elizabeth would live. The realization hit him with unexpected force, bringing tears to his eyes for the first time in years. He'd prayed, and she would live. Coincidence? Perhaps the doctor would certainly credit medical treatment rather than divine intervention, but Zachariah couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had shifted inside him. In the days that followed, Elizabeth's recovery progressed steadily. The town rallied around the Flynns, bringing food, offering assistance with patience, demonstrating the community spirit Elizabeth had spoken of so passionately. Zachariah remained in Promise Creek, postponing his plans to head north. He told himself it was to finish some remaining work on the infirmary, but he knew the truth: he couldn't leave while Elizabeth was still recovering. A week after her fever broke, he found her sitting on the porch of her home, wrapped in a blanket despite the mild autumn day. She smiled as he approached, gesturing to the empty chair beside her. "Father says I'm to get fresh air every day," she explained, "though he doesn't want me venturing beyond the porch just yet." "He's right to be cautious," Zachariah said, taking the offered seat. "You gave us all quite a scare." "So I've been told. Mrs. Holden says the entire town was praying for me." "They were. You've made quite an impression in a short time." Elizabeth studied him, her gaze thoughtful. "And you, Zachariah, you never finished telling me about your praying." He shifted uncomfortably. "Not much to tell. I was desperate. Sometimes that's when faith finds us in our most desperate moments." She pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Father told me how you stayed, how you helped care for me. I'm grateful." "Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said firmly, "not anyone. You're a good man, Zachariah Nichols, despite how hard you try to convince yourself otherwise." Her words pierced him, seeing too clearly the self-loathing he carried. "You don't know me, Elizabeth. The things I've done, I know enough," she interrupted gently. "I know you fought in a war that tore this country apart. I know you've lived a hard life since. And I know that when someone needed you, you were there. The rest is just details." Zachariah stared out at the main street of Promise Creek, watching townsfolk go about their business. "I killed men," he said finally, "not just in the war but after, hunting bounties. Were they dangerous men, criminals?" "Yes, but then you were enforcing the law in places where law is scarce." She reached for his hand. "Zachariah, we all carry burdens from our past. What matters is who we choose to be now, today." Her touch anchored him, and he found himself turning toward her, drawn by her quiet strength and unflinching acceptance. "And who do you think I am?" "Elizabeth Flynn, a man at a crossroads," she replied thoughtfully. "A man with the capacity for great kindness, who spent too long believing he deserves only solitude." The accuracy of her assessment left him momentarily speechless. How had she seen so clearly into his soul in such a short time? "The infirmary is finished," he said abruptly, changing the subject. "Your father says it's ready for patients whenever needed." Elizabeth allowed the diversion. "Yes, and it's wonderful. The town is already talking about what other improvements might be next: a proper schoolhouse, perhaps." "Progress comes quickly to these frontier towns," Zachariah observed. "Soon enough, Promise Creek will be a proper city." "Will you be here to see it?" she asked directly, her eyes searching his. The question hung between them, laden with possibility. Zachariah had been asking himself the same thing for days, weighing the appeal of staying against his habitual restlessness. "I don't know," he admitted honestly. "I've never stayed in one place long since the war. What are you searching for out there on the trail? Peace, maybe, redemption." He gave a humorless laugh. "Though I'm beginning to think those things can't be found by running." Elizabeth nodded slowly. "My mother used to say that peace is not the absence of trouble but the presence of God." I didn't understand what she meant until I was older. The mention of God would have made Zachariah bristle a week ago. Now he found himself considering her words thoughtfully. "When I was kneeling by your bed," he said hesitantly, "praying for the first time in years, I felt something, a kind of calm, even in the midst of terror." "That's faith, Zachariah. It doesn't make the storms disappear, but it gives you an anchor in the tempest." Her description resonated with him: an anchor, something solid to hold onto when life's currents threatened to sweep him away. For years, he'd drifted without such an anchor, letting grief and guilt carry him wherever they willed. "I'm not sure I can be the man of faith my father was," he confessed. "No one's asking you to be. Just be Zachariah Nichols, the man who builds infirmaries and sits with the sick and finds his way back to prayer in his own time." From inside the house, Dr. Flynn called Elizabeth's name. She sighed, reluctantly preparing to rise. "Father worries if I'm out of his sight too long." "Would you help me inside?" Zachariah stood and offered his arm for support. She was still weak from her illness, her steps unsteady. As they reached the door, she paused, looking up at him. Will you come to dinner tomorrow? Father and I would enjoy your company. I'd be honored, he replied, realizing he meant it. The next few weeks established a pattern. Zachariah remained in Promise Creek, taking odd jobs around town repairing the livery stable roof, helping Larson transport lumber, occasionally riding with Marshal Watson to investigate reports of cattle rustling in the region. Most evenings found him at the Flynn home, sharing meals and conversation. Dr. Flynn proved to be a well-read man with interests ranging from scientific advancement to philosophy, while Elizabeth's sharp wit and compassionate insights continually surprised and engaged Zachariah. As October gave way to November, the first snow dusted the mountains surrounding Promise Creek. The passes would close soon, limiting travel until spring. If Zachariah intended to leave, the time was approaching, but the thought of leaving brought no satisfaction, only a hollow ache in his chest. Somewhere along the way, Promise Creek had ceased to be just another town on his endless journey. It had become something dangerously close to home, and Elizabeth, she had recovered her strength, returning to her duties assisting her father. Zachariah often saw her moving purposefully through town on medical errands, stopping to chat with townsfolk, always with a smile that brightened even the dreariest day. When their paths crossed, that smile would turn warmer, more personal, and Zachariah found himself seeking such encounters with increasing frequency. One crisp afternoon, he encountered Elizabeth leaving the general store, her arms laden with packages. He moved to help her, taking the heaviest parcels. "Thank you," she said, falling into step beside him. "These are supplies for the infirmary. Father's concerned about pneumonia cases as winter sets in." "Smart man," Zachariah commented. "First winter in a new climate can be hard on folks." They walked in companionable silence for a moment before Elizabeth spoke again. "The last stage before winter arrived yesterday. Marshal Watson mentioned you'd asked about passage." Zachariah glanced at her, noting the careful neutrality of her expression. "I inquired, yes. Seemed prudent to know my options." "And what did you decide?" Her voice was light, but he heard the tension beneath. They reached the doctor's office, and Zachariah set the packages on the porch, turning to face Elizabeth directly. "I decided I'm not ready to leave Promise Creek," he said simply. Relief washed over her face, followed quickly by a smile that warmed him more effectively than any fire. "I'm glad," she replied. "The town would miss you if you left." "Just the town?" he asked, emboldened by her reaction. A blush colored her cheeks. "No," she admitted softly, "not just the town." Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing steadily since her recovery. Zachariah wanted to say more, to explore this new territory, but patients were waiting inside the office, and Elizabeth had duties to attend. "Dinner tonight?" she asked as she gathered her packages. "I'll be there." That evening, as Zachariah walked to the Flynn home through gently falling snow, he contemplated the changes in his life. 4 months ago, he'd ridden into Promise Creek intent on collecting a bounty and moving on. Now, he was contemplating a future here, perhaps as the town's carpenter, or even Marshal Watson's deputy. More significantly, he was contemplating a future that included Elizabeth Flynn. The thought both exhilarated and terrified him. He hadn't allowed himself to care so deeply for anyone since before the war. Opening his heart again meant risking pain, risking loss. But Elizabeth's illness had taught him a harsh lesson: loss could come whether he guarded his heart or not. The only choice was whether to embrace love while it was possible. Dr. Flynn answered Zachariah's knock, welcoming him warmly. Come in. Elizabeth's just finishing in the kitchen. We're celebrating tonight." "What's the occasion?" Zachariah asked, removing his coat and hat. "The infirmary's first success story," the doctor explained proudly. "Little Tommy Jenkins was brought in yesterday with early signs of pneumonia. Thanks to the isolated treatment space and Elizabeth's excellent care, he's already showing improvement, and no one else in his family has fallen ill." "That's wonderful news," Zachariah said sincerely. "The infirmary is fulfilling its purpose, indeed it is, and we have you to thank for making it a reality so quickly." Elizabeth emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her face was flushed from cooking, her hair slightly disheveled, and Zachariah thought she had never looked more beautiful. "I heard," she said, smiling broadly. "Father's been telling everyone who'll listen about Tommy's improvement." With good reason, Zachariah replied. It's an achievement worth celebrating. Dinner was a festive affair with a roast chicken, fresh bread, and even a berry pie for dessert. The conversation flowed easily, touching on town news, medical developments, and plans for the coming winter months. As they sat by the fire after the meal, sipping coffee, Dr. Flynn surprised Zachariah with a question. Have you given any thought to a more permanent occupation here in Promise Creek, Mr. Nichols? I notice you've been taking various jobs around town. Zachariah set down his cup carefully. I've been considering my options. Marshall Watson has suggested deputy work, and there seems to be steady demand for carpentry. Both worthy pursuits, the doctor nodded approvingly. A growing town needs good lawmen and skilled builders, and he glanced meaningfully at his daughter. It provides a solid foundation for a man considering putting down roots. Elizabeth blushed at her father's transparent hint. Father, please don't embarrass Mr. Nichols. Not at all, Zachariah assured her. Your father's right to be concerned about your friendship with a man of uncertain prospects. Dr. Flynn cleared his throat. Well, since we're speaking frankly, I should mention that I've observed your interest in my daughter, Mr. Nichols, as well as her regard for you. While I might have had reservations initially, I've come to know you as a man of integrity, despite your unconventional past. Thank you, sir, Zachariah replied, genuinely touched by the doctor's approval. Your good opinion means a great deal to me. That said, Doctor. Flynn continued with a slight smile. I find myself suddenly remembering some patient notes that require my attention, if you'll both excuse me for a short while. With that transparent excuse, he left them alone in the parlor, the crackling fire the only sound disrupting the sudden silence. Elizabeth laughed softly. Subtle, isn't he? About as subtle as a stampede, Zachariah agreed, though he was grateful for the opportunity to speak with Elizabeth privately. But I appreciate his trust. She set aside her coffee cup and turned to face him more directly. He's grown fond of you, as have I. Zachariah moved to sit beside her on the settee, gathering his courage. Elizabeth, I've been thinking about what you said about who I choose to be now, today. And who is that? She asked softly. A man who's tired of running. A man who's found something worth staying for. He took her hand in his, marveling at how natural it felt. Someone worth staying for, her fingers tightened around his. Zachariah. I can't promise I'll never have dark days, he continued earnestly. The past doesn't disappear overnight. But I want to build a future here with you if you'll have me. Elizabeth's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. I've been hoping you'd say that. Ever since I recovered from the fever, I've felt this connection between us growing stronger. When I was ill, lost in delirium, I heard your voice praying for me, saying my name. It called me back, anchored me. I was so afraid of losing you, he admitted. It made me realize how much you'd come to mean to me in such a short time. Sometimes the heart knows what it wants before the mind catches up, she said wisely. My mother used to tell me that when love is real, it finds you at the right moment, not necessarily the expected one. Zachariah raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman. She was. I think she would have liked you very much. The fire popped loudly, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing Promise Creek in pristine white, muffling the sounds of the town as night deepened. May I call on you properly? Zachariah asked. Court you as you deserve to be courted, Elizabeth's smile widened. I would like nothing better. Winter settled over Promise Creek with a peaceful stillness. The town adjusted to the slower pace of the season, with social gatherings taking precedence over outdoor labor. The church hosted weekly socials, the saloon organized card tournaments, and homes throughout town took turns hosting dinners and musical evenings. Zachariah and Elizabeth were regular attendees at these events, their courtship conducted under the approving eyes of the community. Zachariah found himself increasingly comfortable with town life, even attending Sunday services with the Flynns tentatively at first, then with growing conviction as his long-dormant faith began to reawaken. By Christmas, Zachariah had established himself as Promise Creek's primary carpenter, with orders for furniture and cabinetry that would keep him busy through spring. He rented a small cabin on the edge of town, and transformed one room into a workshop where he crafted pieces that quickly gained recognition for their quality and artistry. On Christmas Eve, after the church service, Zachariah escorted Elizabeth and her father home through swirling snow. The town was beautiful in its winter dress, windows glowing with lamplight, wreaths adorning doors, the scent of pine and cinnamon in the crisp air. At the Flynn home, Dr. Flynn tactfully excused himself to check on a patient, leaving Zachariah and Elizabeth alone on the porch. Snowflakes caught in her hair and eyelashes as she looked up at him, her expression warm despite the cold. "I have something for you," Zachariah said, reaching into his coat pocket. "A Christmas gift." He handed her a small wooden box, beautifully crafted from cherry wood with intricate carving around the edges, hours of painstaking work, done by lamplight after long days. Elizabeth opened it carefully, gasping when she saw the contents, a delicate silver pendant in the shape of a tiny book, hanging from a fine chain. "It's beautiful," she breathed, lifting it from its velvet nest. "Open it," Zachariah encouraged. The pendant was actually a locket. Inside, Zachariah had placed a tiny scrap of paper with a single word written in his neat hand. Elizabeth, her eyes filled with tears as she recognized the significance. "Your prayer." "My first prayer in years," he confirmed, his voice husky with emotion. "Your name brought me back to faith, Elizabeth. It seemed fitting to commemorate that." "Help me put it on," she requested, turning and lifting her hair. Zachariah fastened the chain around her neck, his fingers brushing the soft skin at her nape. When she turned back to face him, the locket rested just below her throat, catching the light from the windows. "I'll treasure it always," she promised, rising on tiptoes to kiss his cheek. "Merry Christmas, Zachariah. Merry Christmas, Elizabeth." He gathered his courage and added, "I love you." It was the first time he'd spoken the words aloud, though they had been in his heart for weeks. Elizabeth's face lit up with joy. "And I love you," she replied without hesitation, "with all my heart." Zachariah pulled her gently into his arms, and their lips met in a tender kiss, a promise of the future they would build together. Spring came early to Promise Creek that year, the snow melting to reveal tender green shoots pushing through the softening earth. The town bustled with renewed activity, buildings being repaired after winter's toll, gardens planted, merchandise arriving on the regular stagecoach. Now that the passes were clear, Zachariah's business flourished, and he began construction on a proper workshop beside his cabin. With Dr. Flynn's blessing, he and Elizabeth had announced their engagement in February, planning a June wedding when the wildflowers would be in full bloom. On a warm April evening, Zachariah sat on the porch of his cabin, whittling a small wooden horse, a gift for Tommy Jenkins, fully recovered from his winter illness. Elizabeth rode up on her mare, dismounting gracefully and tying the horse to the hitching post. "I thought I'd find you here," she called, making her way up the path. She wore a simple riding dress, her honey-colored hair braided loosely down her back. The silver locket gleamed at her throat, never absent since Christmas. Zachariah set aside his carving and rose to greet her with a kiss. "This is a pleasant surprise. I thought you were helping your father with inventories today. We finished early and it was too beautiful to stay indoors." She settled beside him on the porch steps, leaning comfortably against his shoulder. "What are you making?" He showed her the half-finished horse. "For Tommy, his mother says he's fascinated with horses since he recovered. You'll make a wonderful father someday," Elizabeth observed, a hint of wistfulness in her voice. "Patient and thoughtful." Zachariah put his arm around her, drawing her closer. "I hope so. I never thought much about family before I met you. Now I can't imagine a future without children, our children running around this place." "I was thinking the same thing." She hesitated, then added, "Actually, I've been considering the logistics of continuing my medical work after we're married. Most women give it up, but you're not most women," Zachariah finished for her. "And I wouldn't want you to be. Your calling is part of who you are, Elizabeth." "I'd never ask you to abandon it." Relief washed over her face. "Father says we could expand the practice. With 3 of us, him, me, and eventually a nurse or assistant, we could serve more patients, maybe even neighboring settlements." "It's a fine plan," Zachariah agreed. "And this workshop I'm building could easily become a proper furniture business with apprentices someday." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the western sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Promise Creek lay spread before them, growing and changing yet somehow remaining the same at its heart, a community of people working together, supporting one another. "Do you ever miss it?" Elizabeth asked suddenly. "The trail, the freedom of movement." Zachariah considered the question honestly. "Sometimes I miss the solitude, the wide open spaces. But then I remember how empty those spaces felt, how the freedom was really just another word for having nothing to lose." He turned to look at her, taking in every beloved feature of her face. "What I have now, this town, a purpose it's worth more than any freedom I've known. Even with the complications, the responsibilities," she pressed, "especially with those things." He smiled, remembering her words from months ago. "You were right, you know. Peace isn't found by running from trouble. It's found in facing life alongside those you love." Elizabeth leaned up to kiss him softly. "When did you get so wise, Zachariah Nichols?" "I had an excellent teacher," he replied, returning her kiss with gentle passion. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "I thank God every day that I rode into Promise Creek that evening." "As do I," she whispered. "As do I." In June, as planned, they were married in the town church, with Dr. Flynn proudly walking his daughter down the aisle. Elizabeth wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit her slender frame, and carried wildflowers gathered by the town children. Zachariah stood nervously at the altar in a new suit, Marshall Watson serving as his best man. The entire town attended, filling the church to capacity and spilling onto the street outside. After the ceremony, tables laden with food lined the main street, and music played while couples danced under the open sky. It was a celebration not just of Zachariah and Elizabeth's union, but of the community that had brought them together. As twilight fell, the newlyweds slipped away from the festivities, mounting their horses for the short ride to their home, Zachariah's cabin, expanded and improved over the spring months. Inside, Zachariah lit the lamps while Elizabeth moved about the main room, touching the furniture he had crafted with his own hands, admiring the curtains Mrs. Holden had sewn as a wedding gift, adjusting the books neatly arranged on shelves built into the wall. "It's perfect," she declared, turning to her husband with shining eyes. "Absolutely perfect." Zachariah crossed the room to take her in his arms, overwhelmed by the journey that had brought him to this moment. From a faithless drifter to a man with purpose, home, and love, it seemed almost miraculous. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed, his voice thick with emotion. "After the war, after all I'd seen and done, I convinced myself I didn't deserve happiness." Elizabeth reached up to touch his face tenderly. "Everyone deserves a chance at happiness, Zachariah, even lost cowboys who have forgotten how to pray." He smiled at her characterization, recognizing its truth. "Well, this particular lost cowboy has found his way, thanks to a remarkable woman who taught him to believe again in himself, in others, in God. We found each other," Elizabeth corrected gently. "And together we found our path forward." Outside, the stars emerged one by one, bright pinpricks in the velvet darkness. Inside the cabin, a new life began, one built on love, faith, and the promise of tomorrow. Years passed, and Promise Creek grew into a proper town with a railroad station, a school, and a growing population. The Flynn medical practice flourished under the combined expertise of Dr. Flynn, Elizabeth, and the young nurse they hired from Denver. Zachariah's furniture became known throughout the territory for its quality and craftsmanship, and he took on 3 apprentices to meet the demand. Their family grew as well. 2 years after their wedding, Elizabeth gave birth to a son they named Michael, after Zachariah's father. A daughter, Sarah, followed 18 months later. The children filled their home with laughter and energy, bringing joy even on the most challenging days. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Zachariah surprised Elizabeth with a new house on the edge of town larger than their cabin, with a dedicated treatment room where she could see patients when needed, and a proper workshop for his woodworking. "It's magnificent," she gasped as he showed her through the rooms, the children racing ahead to explore their new bedrooms. "But how did you manage it without my knowing?" "I had help," Zachariah admitted with a grin. "Your father was an excellent conspirator. And Larson's men are remarkably discreet when properly motivated." That evening, after the children were asleep in their new beds, Zachariah and Elizabeth sat on the porch of their home, watching fireflies dance in the gathering darkness. Elizabeth's head rested against Zachariah's shoulder, her hand clasped in his. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Completely," she assured him. "Though I can hardly believe it's been 5 years. Sometimes it feels like yesterday that you rode into town all dust and determination. And sometimes it feels like I've been here my whole life," he mused. "Like everything before was just preparation for finding you." Elizabeth smiled, turning to kiss his cheek. "Remember when you told me you were searching for peace and redemption on the trail?" "I remember." "Did you find them, Zachariah? Here with us?" He considered the question thoughtfully, his gaze taking in the town that had become his home, the family that had become his heart's center. "I found something better," he said finally. "I found purpose, I found belonging. I found that redemption isn't something you discover out there," he nodded toward the distant horizon, "but something you build day by day through the choices you make and the love you give." "And peace," Elizabeth prompted gently. Zachariah pulled her closer, dropping a kiss on the top of her head. "Peace is sitting here with you, knowing our children sleep safely inside, hearing the sounds of our town settling down for the night. Peace is knowing that whatever comes tomorrow, we'll face it together." "Then we've both found what we were looking for," Elizabeth concluded contentedly. "Even if it wasn't what we expected." Inside the house, a child's voice called sleepily for a drink of water. Elizabeth rose with a soft laugh. "Duty calls." Zachariah caught her hand before she could go, drawing her down for a tender kiss. "I love you, Elizabeth Nichols, more with each passing day." "And I love you, my praying cowboy," she replied with a smile that still took his breath away. "Always and forever." As Elizabeth went to attend to their child, Zachariah remained on the porch, gazing up at the star-filled sky. The universe was vast, full of mystery and wonder, but he no longer felt lost within it. He had found his place, his purpose, his peace. And it had all begun with a whispered prayer, a single name spoken in desperation that had opened the door to faith, to hope, to love. "Thank you," he murmured to the night sky, a prayer of gratitude replacing the pleading of years past. Then he rose and went inside to join his family, closing the door on the darkness and stepping into the light of home.